Today I'm going to discuss some of the common implements for serving gelato and some of the basic techniques for serving it reasonably well and keeping an eye on it and its consistency and texture. All the things I'm about to show you, you pretty much need next to the gelato when you're actively serving. Some of them are completely obvious, like napkins, which can be used both for cleaning up the gelato machine and surfaces and for handing to the customer. Then you need cups. These are two typical Italian service cups. This is a mediolo. It's a marigold yellow color. And this is a grande, which is a blue. This one, despite looking moderately small, actually holds quite a bit of gelato. If you eat this whole thing, you'll feel like you had a real dessert. So gelato is like, it's got a decent amount of sugar and stuff. A heaping one of these is a lot of dessert. More than anyone except a sort of beast mode eater like myself can eat. Okay, other things you'll need: serving spoons for the customers, not for scooping, but for actually eating it. This is a container. They're typical little plastic Italian spoons. Usually I let the customer get them themselves. You also use these for tastes. If they ask for a taste of a particular flavor, you take one of these and scoop it. I'll show that. It is useful to have it where the customers can themselves get the spoons, like that way you don't have to deal with it. Also important are what you're going to scoop with. This is an insulated bucket. It's actually empty right now, but normally you put warm water in it. It's useful for rinsing off scoopers. I would suggest at least 2 scoopers per flavor because often one needs to be washed or rinsed, and you don't want to mix the ones from various flavors. So here are 2 different kinds of scoopers. This is a traditional gelato spade. It's my personal favorite. It's called a spade because, well, it looks like a spade. This is for scooping down the gelato. It's very strong, and for like smearing it into the cup in the sort of traditional Italian style. This is like a more American-sized ball scooper. I don't like the ones with the little things because they always get jammed, and then you have to use some other implement or your finger, which you should not ever do, to get the gelato off. This kind has some kind of, if it stays in the warm, it's got like a gel inside and warms up a bit, so it cuts through the gelato / ice cream easier, and you can make little balls that come in different sizes. This here is a Iffy Pozzetti Panorama. This series of videos I've been talking about gelato served in pozzetti, which are these big 7-liter kind of vertical tubs. Gelato's often sometimes served in pans as well, like more traditionally in Italy. The pozzetti are actually better in terms of ease of serving, and particularly in terms of like keeping the gelato in good shape, and which is a matter really of temperature consistency, which we'll talk about in a bit. But let's take a look here. I'm just going to open these up. I've got 4 tubs of gelato in this particular one. In all these things, whether it's the cool box, which is a non-condenser controlled Iffy, or this electronic high voltage Iffy, you always want to keep tubs in it even if there's no gelato. So over there on the far side there's empty tubs in the spots, otherwise the cold air from below gets out. The air comes in from below and radiates around the sides of the gelato. And these are anti-rotational. There's like a lock so they don't rotate too easily. I mean, they will shuffle around a little bit. As a general rule, I'm going to show you with the spade, like getting a little gelato out. With these tubs, you don't necessarily want to dig across the top surface. I usually like kind of make a wedge and dig down and then kind of cut in from there. You can sort of do what you want, but if you dig down straight from the top, it doesn't look quite as pretty, like because the top has a nicer surface. But with a spade, you basically just take some gelato, which this is nice proper gelato consistency. You see it's like kind of goopy. Just smear it into the thing, and you keep smearing until you get the desired amount. With a ball scooper, like, you can attempt to get a nice ball in there, which can be a little trickier with gelato because of its soft texture. The gelato in its tubs here. Oh, there's the compressor. And you can see at the beginning when they're pretty full, it can be a little tough to start scooping without like making a mess, and you just have to try carefully not to get anything to kind of come off out of the tub. Also, as you scoop gelato, there'll be some tendency as your hand gets down in there for your hand itself on the handle, or the handle itself to like get into the gelato. Try to avoid this. Because I advise wearing either gloves, and certainly wash your hands like repeatedly before serving, and try not to actually touch the gelato with your hands. Now the The spade or scooper will eventually get gelato like on the handle and stuff. It's fairly inevitable, and that's when it needs to get washed and your backup scooper needs to be swapped in. You're just gonna have to keep doing that. Okay, let's discuss gelato temperature, which is the most important thing to understand about gelato. Gelato, and gelato in one of these posetti, just an individual blob of gelato, has different textures at different temperatures, and you have to learn to recognize that texture and understand what temperature it is and where it's going, or you will just ruin the whole batch and or not be able to serve it. So at below about -5 Fahrenheit, gelato is hard, like a cold packed ice cream, and virtually unscoopable. So down at like -10, -15, it is unscoopable. You won't get anything into it. It's like a brick. Okay. Even at like 0, whatever, you would have a very hard time scooping it. You're going to be hurting your hand. It's possible, but it depends on how strong your scooper is. At somewhere between 5 and 8 is perfect gelato scooping temperature. Positive Fahrenheit. It's soft, but it's not getting liquid at all. As you rise above that into 10, 12, and up, it's going to start to get sort of like runny on the surface and get really soft, like where it wouldn't hold a ball form and stuff like that. That's too warm, because as soon as it tilts over in an area which is like surprisingly below actual freezing, which is 32, but somewhere in like the teens, it will start to run. Now it tastes good at this point. Like, so if it's running in the cup, that's absolutely fine. But if it's running in the service machine, what that means is that liquid part is going to lose the air that makes gelato like kind of soft and pleasant textured and turn this liquid form. And then if it goes back in the freezer, it goes down to a lower temperature. We'll discuss the raising and lowering the temperature in a minute. The newly frozen, formerly melted parts will refreeze without like in a kind of nasty crystallized way, which is, again, the taste will be the same, but it's got these, the texture will be much impaired, and the product is overall, to my standards as a master gelatotician, unacceptable. Like, gelato should never melt and be refrozen. You have to understand this, keep an eye on it, and understand what you can do. If it's in a storage freezer, like my storage freezer over here, which is -15, it's gonna be like a brick. Now, the tub of gelato, in normal thermodynamic sense. So this stainless, it's a conductor, in fact. So temperature is going to radiate in and out from all directions, but from the surface, which is like what any mass will do. So in a closed condenser unit gelato machine, like the one I was scooping from a few minutes ago, particularly when it's closed, you can hear it running now, the cold is radiating from the sides and bottom. The top is closed, so it's like maybe the top's a little warmer, but not much. It's pretty evenly temperatured. And when the cool box is closed, is like, its freezer packs are fresh and it's closed, kind of the same thing. But when it's open, either it be the condenser machine or the cool box, the top surface is going to be much warmer than the side surfaces and bottom. Side and the bottom, the metal parts of this, are where the cold is going to be like radiating into the gelato from. So if you had to want a gelato tub that's frozen like a brick, coming in the morning like out of the colder freezer, okay, and you want to warm it up where you can scoop it, okay, and you stick it in the cool box, it's going, if it was very hard and bricky, it's going to take several hours, like 3, to reach a scoopable temperature, and you leave it in there with the thing cold and it will just slowly warm up. But it doesn't look any different because it's still frozen, but the percentage of like, and sort of structural strength of the ice crystals is reducing. Now, as long as it's in the freezing range, maybe 5 Fahrenheit, negative whatever, it can move back and forth many times here and not crystallize, because it's not actually melting. It is just warming up. But the surface part will be easier to scoop at the beginning. It'll have this hard as a rock core, like if it's not fully sort of evened out in temperature. Now, what you do not ever do is go, oh, I'll just warm it up by leaving it like out on the counter. Now, while that will warm the outer layer very transiently, and you can catch it if you're keeping an eye on it at like a good temperature, the inner core is going to remain frozen like a brick, and then the outer layer will just start to melt and weep well before the inner thing. Like that kind of high temperature difference thawing will not thaw gelato in any way that is useful. You have to warm it up by moving it from the very cold freezer into something that is like no warmer than like 8 Fahrenheit. and leave it for some considerable time for that warmth to penetrate slowly into the core of the tub. Then while you're serving it, you want to keep the lids of whatever serving unit, like the cool box, closed as much as possible, particularly because the cool box does not power it. It's got a certain finite charged cold energy in those cool packs, and that'll be running down. Unlike this compressor machine, which can indefinitely suck off the wall outlet and keep the thing cold. So when you have the top open, which you of course need to do when you're serving, but that will warm the top of the gelato and just sort of in general suck heat out of the cool box's cooling units. These compressor ones, you could leave the top open for considerable time, even hours actually, and the gelato will stay kind of nice because the compressor will just run more. With the cool box, you have to keep a close eye on what the texture is, particularly at the top. If it starts to get dangerously soft or weepy at all, it's time to move the gelato back into a freezer, at least for a bit, to try to like freeze that outer layer before it gets runny, and the refreezing will compromise its texture. If it's just a little soft, you can refreeze it down without hurting it. Also have to be aware that those cool box pre-frozen cooling units will sort of run down over time, like they will get less cold. And eventually you have to swap them out for a backup pair. And if you've already swapped out a backup pair, you're done. Everything has to go back into the freezer. And you know, this is sort of affected by the ambient temperature of the day and stuff, but you have to keep an eye on it. It's important if you don't want to ruin the product. Don't let it get to the level of shiny, runny on the surface. That's a warning sign that it needs to go in the freezer. You need to close the top, develop some feel for it, but like better too cold and a little hard to scoop than melted and ruined. Once it's melted, there's no coming back from that.